And it's time for another installment of Marshall Law here on Indiana in the Morning, featuring Marshall Chriswell. This radio program intended to be for informational purposes only. This information does not constitute legal advice. The law is constantly changing. The information may not be complete or correct depending on the date and your particular legal problem. Each legal problem depends on its individual facts, and different jurisdictions have different laws and regulations. Because of that, you should not act or rely on any information in this segment without seeking the advice of a competent attorney licensed to practice law in your jurisdiction for your particular problem. And Marshall's on the phone with us today. We're talking about real estate law. Today, it's a very, very hot market right now in real estate, and there are some things you need to know both from the seller's standpoint and the buyer's standpoint. So let's welcome him in, Marshall. Let's talk a little real estate today. It is a booming market.
The real estate market in Indiana County and the surrounding areas has been very, very strong. A lot of properties moving. I think for a few years here we've had a large backlog of properties, particularly in the borough and White Township, and I think we're seeing a lot of those coming off the market, and just real estate moving in general, and a lot of it has to do with the low interest rates.
Yeah. All right. So all of that being the case, there's probably good time for a little bit of a primer, if you will, on what we should be thinking about in terms of real estate law from a buyer's standpoint and a seller's standpoint. And let's start as somebody who is a seller. What are some of the big points we need to know? If I have a property, I want to sell it, but I know that I shouldn't just put a sign out and say, stop by and I'll give you this place. There's a lot of things that go into it.
Right. I suggest that, you start with contacting a lawyer. A lot of people, whether you're selling or whether you're buying, the lawyer is kind of one of the last folks that they end up in touch with, because it's when they start to think about, okay, I've got my deal in place and we're moving towards closing, and now we need lawyers to draw up the paperwork and such. But I do recommend consulting with an attorney before, as you start the process, because obviously, for those of us that do real estate law, we handle so many of these transactions. We see, how things go and what the potential pitfalls and trouble spots are, and how you can protect yourself from the beginning. Now, from a seller's perspective, obviously the big decision that a seller makes up front whenever they're thinking about selling is, am I going to list the property with a real estate agent, or am I going to try to sell it by owner, try to sell it myself for a period of time first? And particularly if you're going to be doing it for sale by owner, you want to get an attorney on board immediately, because you want to, whenever you want to learn how to, for one, get the right documents in place, your sales agreement in place, and things like that, so that you have that, drawn up, and you're not scribbling on the back of a napkin when somebody comes to the house and says, "Oh yeah, I'd like to make you an offer," and then just generally, talk through, okay, how do we value the property? What are we gonna do to put a value on it? And what range of offers are you willing to accept? And talk through, what are different contingencies that a buyer is going to look for, and what makes one offer stronger than another, whether it's dollar value and the contingencies that are attached to it, and what kind of financing they may be able to get, and how do you have some security moving forward? Do you want to make sure to get a pre-approval letter from the buyers? All those things that you may not think of if this is your first time selling a house.
There also are liabilities, are there not, for those who don't properly disclose everything about a property that a potential buyer needs to know?
Absolutely, and that's something that not many folks are aware of or think about when they're deciding to sell their house. For any residential real estate transaction where there's less than four or less living units on the property, Pennsylvania law says that the seller has to provide a seller's disclosure, and it's a very specific. It's a document that provides very specific disclosures as to all of the different systems and amenities and utilities and everything in the home, and even issues of boundary and survey and water quality and all these things that, if you have any knowledge of deficiencies or issues that you've had in those areas, you've got to disclose those to the buyer. And so you really should do that when the sales agreement is signed, prior to them signing the sales agreement. I've had lots of folks come in with, handwritten contracts or things they've got off the internet that they have a buyer sign, and then I say, okay, well, did you do a seller's disclosure? Oh, no, didn't know we had to do that. And then you have to disclose things, and sometimes there are things that maybe even the seller didn't think about whenever he was in discussions with the buyer to tell them, oh, we had water in the basement 3 years ago, or whatever it is. And then, the buyer comes back and says, well, I have questions about that, and now I'm not really sure about this offer that I put in. So, yeah, absolutely. You've got to comply with those laws, and if you don't, and if you go through the process, you don't provide those disclosures, and the buyer, a year from now has an issue that should have, it's related to something that should have been disclosed. Now, I mean, you've got a big problem. You could be, on the hook for that.
Yeah, so the attorney is going to help you identify those before they become a bigger problem, and you need the attorney for a whole other reason.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. That's what a lot of my job is. Right. Just preventing people from having to come back to me in the future. Yeah.
Yeah. Identify the potential mess before it becomes one.
That's right.
There's a very basic thing that an attorney would be helpful as well, and isn't that the title search and the different property limitations that are out there?
Yep, and a lot of times you think about, from a buyer's perspective, of course, once before you go to closing, you're going to want to have a title search done where, we're doing a search for, to check the chain of title, make sure the chain of title is intact, make sure the property description is adequate, and look at any issues of surveys and lot lines and setback lines, and look for liens and judgments and mortgages and all these things that are going to need to be taken care of before you purchase the place. But something that's overlooked is sellers, and smart sellers will do this. They'll come to an attorney beforehand and say, hey, will you take at least a cursory look at the title and just see if there are any glaring issues? And, might pay for a couple hours of an attorney's time, but then you're going to know. And it's not going to be something, if there is an issue, it's not going to be something like this. Last week I had, I'm representing a seller, and all of a sudden we're a couple weeks from closing, the title search comes back, and there's a mortgage from 1988 with an old defunct government agency that funded some old farm loans that never issued a satisfaction on the record. It's just, so there's a $100,000 mortgage just hanging out there on the record that, and now the buyer is saying, well, that's got to be taken care of before we buy it. Mm-hmm. Closing certainly may be delayed. So, but point is, if this person would have come to me beforehand and said, hey, would you just take a quick look at the title? That would have showed up immediately. We could have taken care of it before the property was even on the market.
Yeah. There's an issue for buyers as well that I'm aware of from a neighborhood in which the buyer assumed that what was under the ground was just dirt, and it turned out that there were two main gas lines running underneath their ground that would prevent them from, in this case, digging for a pool, because you had the two big gas mains that went right underneath their backyard. And of course, there were also questions about mineral rights, gas rights, those sorts of things. Those are things that need to be paid attention to.
They are. Every time I do a title search, I issue a title certification letter to the buyer, and it's going to list all of those issues. So you'll have it all in one place. You can look at it and say, okay, there's a pipeline easement running through this property, where, and then you can go and we can look at the maps, or we can get in touch with the gas company and say, okay, where exactly do these run? How close to the house are they? And to your point, is it going to be an impediment for any future development or improvements that you may have planned?
Yeah, so all of those things are things to pay attention to when you are just at the beginning of this whole process, and the line of succession after you're gone and your estate. That all becomes a part of the equation, maybe a little bit further down the road. But
that's a discussion that we always have with a buyer, because that discussion starts with, all right, you're going to be obtaining title to property. Number one, how are we going to title the property? Is it going to be titled to you solely? If you're married, is it going to be titled to the husband and wife jointly? Is that a good idea in this case? What are we going to do? And then, generally that just organically begins a discussion of, well, hey, I'm not going to be around forever. What's going to happen to this property, when I'm not? And so, we a lot of times with somebody buying a home, buying some real estate, it organically becomes an estate plan conversation because it's when you start thinking about those things.
Yeah. One other thing that I know that we have discussed in the past is access to the property, access roads that involve other property owners nearby. Those issues have to be cleared right at the start as well.
Absolutely. One of the first things we're going to look at is, what is the state of the access to the property? And a lot of times, right, it's pretty obvious. The property directly abuts a private road, a public easement, and so that's not an issue. But for many properties, particularly in rural areas, you're looking at private roads, private easements that cross one or more neighboring properties. Maybe they've been in use for a very long time, but there is, there's always a concern there of what if you get some neighbors that aren't so friendly and they decide they're going to put a gate up and try to block access, or issues of maintenance. All right, well, who's going to take care of the snow in the winter and making sure that if it's a dirt road that it gets some gravel or whatever issues that you have there. So those are things that you want to know right up front, and you really don't want to buy property unless you have in writing you've got access, or you know that you have a very, very, very strong legal case for a right of access in the event someone would contest it.
I once sold a piece of property to a gentleman who was, I'm not going to say he was unprepared, but he showed up at the attorney's office to sign the final documents and turn over the check, and he actually wrote the amount of the check on his hand. Probably not the best policy when selling a piece of property.
Probably not.
All right. Marshall Chriswell has been with us here this morning. So somebody wants to learn more, somebody wants to engage you to help them in the transition of their property. What should they do?
Sure, and we, like you said, we represent buyers, sellers, folks that are refinancing, and then all manner of real estate disputes. And you can give us a call at 724-465-5826. You can come and see us in the R&P Cole Building on Church Street in Indiana, or go online to www.westernpalawyer.com.
Hey, have a great day, Marshall. Thanks for being with us.
You too. See ya. You too. See ya. You too.